Hi, and welcome to Meet the Media Guru with Jeffrey Schnapp. I'm Alessia Bimonte from Meet, and I'm going to explain you how our platform works. It's divided into two sections. On your left, the live streaming of the event. On your right, the live chat moderated on Slido. You can write down your questions and use the poll tab to interact with us during all the event. Feel free to share your questions also on our social network, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I leave the floor to Maria Grazia Mattei, founder and president, Meet.
Hello, welcome to the second event of AI4Future Days. It's a special program. I'm Maria Grazia Mattei, founder of Meet, the first Italian center dedicated to the promotion and dissemination of a digital culture. Creativity and multidisciplinary are key topics for Meet, that is a regional start center and official partner of the new European Bauhaus, the new movement launched by Ursula von der Leyen to design a more beautiful, green and inclusive Europe. In this way, Meet is a part of the AI4Future, a project founded by the Creative Europe program to improve the understanding and dissemination of artificial intelligence technology as a leverage for creativity to design a beautiful, green and inclusive future. AI4Future wants to reflect on mobility, in this case, this evening, through its various meanings, that is mobility across the national borders, green and sustainable transportation, mobility as a digital or social leverage. In one word, mobility in the post-COVID era. That is our goal, our mission in this moment. And this evening, we are here to reflect about this subject with Jeffrey Schnapp. Hello, Jeffrey. Happy to meet you in this special event. Jeffrey Schnapp is a Meet's friend and guru. Jeffrey is the founder of the faculty director of metaLAB at Howard University and the faculty co-director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Howard University, and is also the chief visionary office at the Piaggio Fast Forward. Welcome, Jeffrey. Thank you to be here. I'm very, very happy to see you, and I'm very excited to attend your talk. So the virtual stage, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Maria Grazia, and thank you all for joining in this conversation. We can run the first slide if the direction will put that up. Super. And I just want to make sure I know how to change my slides here. Let's just see. Okay, there we go. All right. So on the one side, as Maria Grazia was kind enough to note, I'm the founder director of metaLAB, which is a community of creative technologists, thinkers, designers, and artists dedicated to experimenting with the networked arts and humanities. And at metaLAB, we don't just theorize about the future of society and culture. We actually seek to model it, to make it, which is why we call ourselves an idea foundry, a knowledge design lab, and a production studio. And on the other side, I'm the co-founder of a robotics company that launched its first products in early 2020. And what you see on the right side of the slide is a sidewalk vehicle, a follow me robot called Gita, which in Italian means a pleasure trip. And the kinds of trips that a vehicle like Gita seeks to support are the sorts of trips that will lead an entire society to walk instead of reaching for the keys to an automobile, and in ways that are supported by a number of technologies, including AI. So I approach the question of AI from wearing two separate hats, but with a single philosophy. Now, given how prominently AI figures in many futurist scenarios for future mobility systems, I'd like to preface my remarks with a few framework considerations. First of all, AI isn't new. It's been with us for nearly 6 decades now. And AI doesn't belong to Silicon Valley any more than it belongs to Google or to DeepMind. It remains a global work in progress. It's research in progress, and it has the capacity to do extraordinary things at expanded scales, particularly things that involve everything from large-scale data sets to expanded modes of creative experimentation. And it's the latter that we employ at the latter is the way we employ AI at metaLAB. A case in point being a flitting atlas of the human gaze, which you are viewing on screen. It's, as I think maybe you can intuit, an interactive platform that's built upon the AI-based extraction and analysis of pairs of eyes from the Harvard Museum's photograph, paintings, print, sculpture, and coin collections that have been analyzed by an artificial intelligence and mapped from the standpoint of the directionality of the depicted subject's gaze. And this kind of use of AI is also how my colleague Emilio Vavarella makes use of AI as a creative and critical feature of his own work. And I'm super pleased to see that he'll be speaking tomorrow. I was really gratified by that. But it's also crucially important to emphasize that AI relies upon rigid data architectures, forms of abstraction, and structures of dependency that bear little resemblance to the textured, multisensory percepta that feed human intelligence or that characterize a complex, multi-layered spatial and multisensory reality like that of a city. The city is a kind of reality where human factors and factors that elude simple modes of quantification necessarily prevail. Second, artificial intelligence, whether it's the AI of the 1970s or the impressive GPT-3 of today, is not an intelligence of the generalized, fluid, flexible, forward-looking, improvisation-capable sort that we usually understand when humans speak of intelligence. The same goes for machine learning, which isn't learning in the conventional sense. Both work best on well-bounded problems tackled by slogging through enormous training data sets. A large deep learning model typically consumes the equivalent of the lifetime emissions of 5 automobiles. So this is a very computationally intensive process. Pattern recognition at scale is its strength, but pattern recognition isn't thinking. It's only a first stepping stone towards thought. Many steps removed from critical or creative thought. So these are powerful tools, but like all tools, they do some things well and they do other things poorly. And third, I don't accept the premise that today's AI, or for that matter, robotics, are qualitatively different with respect to prior technologies. In other words, that they aren't just another set of tools. So for that very reason, I don't accept that either today or tomorrow they will somehow compromise or compete with the human in unprecedented ways. I take instead a kind of long anthropological view. Just like a hammer turns every human into a hammerer, so machines like typewriters, telephones, automobiles, and the like reshaped human cognition, culture, and society during the 20th century. And we're in the information age. We've been undergoing a similar process that imagines the computational and the human as one, but they aren't one. AI is just another tool. And like all tools, it does some things well and others not so well. And when it comes to complex systems like mobility systems, it tends to do things best when rather than seeking to displace the human, it collaborates with the human, which is to say that, in my view, selective and strategic deployments of AI built around human-computer collaboration rather than human-computer competition are likely to prevail. And that brings to mind a memorable witticism that I recently heard, which is that if you believe that technology will solve all your problems, then A, you don't understand your problems, and B, you don't understand technology. So what is the future of mobility? And what I'm going to argue is what might seem like a kind of paradoxical argument, which is that the future of technology is that most primordial technology that defines humans as bipeds, namely walking. And I'm going to look at this argument from a number of different standpoints. I want to look just briefly back at what the future of mobility, the answer to the question of what the future of mobility was in the mid-20th century, to look at versions of that vision that have extended to the present and that centrally involve, among other technologies, AI, and then to look at 7 big trends that I think answer the question of the future of mobility, but in a more fine-grained and nuanced manner. So the city of tomorrow, yesterday, is my point of departure. And what I'd like to start with in this slide is an image from the Futurama exhibit by Norman Bel Geddes, the great American industrial designer, from the 1939 New York World's Fair. This was the General Motors Pavilion. And what it set forth was a vision of the city of the future that we were promised nearly 1 century ago, this sort of frictionless utopia of highways. The installation was itself entitled Magic Motorways. And what it dreams of and what it illustrates here through this very large-scale model that was turned into the film that you're seeing is this sort of world of frictionless motion between country and city. The city transformed into an ideal grid of highly efficient traffic flows with automobiles assigned the royal road and pedestrians separated off in their own world, if you can find any pedestrians at all. Now, this was a vision of the city that we know the consequences of today because we live in cities that descend in one form or another from this vision of the frictionless world of automobile-centric mobility that shaped much of the 20th century. And where has it led us? Contrary to the promises of mid-century futurists of the last century, this sort of romance of the road, the romance of driving, has driven humanity down a dead end whose consequences we live with in our everyday lives. Entire cities have been sacrificed on the altar of automobility. The landscape has been transformed by the sort of vision that Bel Geddes celebrated in Magic Motorways. And nearly a third of urban territory in cities like Milan or Montreal or New York is occupied by cars, parked cars, cars that are simply in storage. And that leaves aside, of course, the other portions of urban centers that are dedicated to automobility in one form or another, whether it's the streets or highways that run through them. And of course, it isn't just simply a matter of an inefficient use of space, it's also a matter of public health. We're currently facing the consequences of the sedentary lifestyles that have citizens of the 20th and 21st centuries have been encouraged to adopt by this mobility infrastructure. People aren't moving more, they're moving less and with greater difficulty. And they're facing the health consequences of these sedentary lifestyles. Now, the awareness of the consequences of the automobile-centric city have been very much part of the conversation about the present and future of mobility and the present and future of city design. So my question of departure here is the question of where that vision of Tomorrowland has landed today. And one of the forms that it has assumed that has been the most influential over the course of the past couple of decades is the notion of the smart city. You see here in this little film clip that I'm going to speak over.
A smart city is
and what a smart city is a city where informational systems, computational systems, sensing systems, technologies have been introduced to improve governance, planning, management, presumably the livability of cities.
There are 5 defining smart cities.
They depend on the gathering of real-world, real-time data. And the expectation among experts is that
Let's take a closer look
there will
at
be
area
trillions of
indicative
gigabytes of
transformation.
data that will be
Today's
generated
version of a smart
through
city
these
uses
sensing
Internet of
systems that
Things,
will
or IoT
become
sensors,
integral
that collect
to
and interpret data
the
to advance our
various
day-to-day
management
lives.
systems, including the
Parks and
mobility
series
management
sites,
systems that will
networks
shape
for crime
the
prevention,
design of
roads that
cities
power the
over
vehicles
the
above them,
coming
all
decades
IoT
and century.
concepts that could become
So when we
intuitive
talk
for
smart
you.
cities,
By these
it's this
advanced
kind of a
definitions,
vision that
there are
typically is implied. And there are forms of research that have been underway that integrate these systems into alternative visions of how such a fundamental feature of the urban landscape as an intersection could be reimagined using the sensing capabilities and the computational abilities of networks. So what you see here is a project that brought together MIT, the Swiss Institute of Technology, and the CNR in Italy, based on a vision of essentially slot-based intersections that would replace traffic lights, reducing queues in design. The idea is, of course, that rather than creating this grinding halt of vehicles at crossroads, there would be this absolutely rationalized traffic flow. Now, you will notice that there's an absence of pedestrians in this world, just like in Norman Belgetti's vision of Tomorrowland. Now, this vision has been expressed in any number of ways by different actors on the scene of debate and planning of present and future cities. And so today's Tomorrowland, today's magic motorways often assume the form of a vision where self-driving vehicles, for example, take over from those human-driven vehicles that were the protagonists of Norman Belgetti's vision. And many of the solutions that Belgetti's was proposing have been adopted, simply translated into the technological language of today, like, for example, the segregation of pedestrians from automobiles in the city of tomorrow. But the deeper question, the question I want to confront, is what kind of quality of life factors go into, what kind of value decisions go into this vision of the future of mobility? Is our dream really to live in cities where, like sheep, we are passengers rather than the protagonists of those urban spaces? Those are the kinds of questions I think that the Tomorrowland of today brings up. So the question is, what's wrong with that picture, and just how smart are these smart cities? And my answer is that they're probably not smart enough. First of all, historical cities were never dumb to begin with. They are built upon layer of human culture and intelligence. And it's this complexity, this palimpsest-like quality that draws us to them. And most important, as I've already hinted at, where are the people? Where is the past? Where is the unplanned, the improvisatory, the fun? Who gets to own, control, and administer the centralized sensing and data systems that are integral to this vision of the smart city? Are there fallback systems when smart systems, so-called smart systems, fail? And where are the poor, the disabled, the disenfranchised? And where does water come from? And where does the garbage go? Where does traditional forms of infrastructure intersect this broader vision? But more importantly, are these the sorts of cities we really dream of living in? Do we wish to? And can we afford to continue 20th century automobile-centric models of urban development? Do these solutions adequately address the practical and infrastructural challenges that actual 21st century metropolises will pose? Are these approaches genuinely sustainable or aligned with the environmental challenges that we are facing as a civilization? How will they age over decades and centuries? And perhaps most of all, will they or do they actually improve the quality of life? So these are the questions that I want to grapple with here. And so to grapple with them, I want to look at 7 interrelated trends, some of which intersect the question of the role of AI, and others which go beyond, which deal particularly with human factors, the kind of human factors I evoked in my preface. So one trend that is absolutely indisputable, and it's a long-term trend, but it's a trend that is accelerating, is urbanization. According to all of the projections that have shaped thinking about the future of cities over the course of the past decades, urbanization is probably the single trend that we have to pay the most attention to. If you look at this chart, which comes from the United Nations Population Division, and it's echoed by numerous other studies, we see that urbanization as a global trend will lead close to 70% of the global population to live in urban areas and the rural populations to diminish. And this is true everywhere in the globe. And so even if we look, for example, at the chart on the left of the 10 largest metropolitan areas in the world, and we compare that to the projected center cities, major mega cities of 2075, you'll notice that there is not a single European or North American city in the top 10 by the time that we reach 2075. That the cities that are projected to be the largest megacities, like Kinshasa, Mumbai, Lagos, Delhi, Dhaka, Kolkata, etc., are all cities in the developing world. So whatever we think about the smart city vision, it is not a vision that is aligned with the likelihood of the challenges that we will be facing when it comes to urban development. So here's a picture of the city of Mexico City today, 22 million inhabitants. It's on the top 10 list, but within 30 years, it won't even be classified among the top 20 cities. And the kinds of challenges that a city like Mexico City will pose will be multiplied when we confront the reality of cities in the developing world. And as a response to those challenges, we've seen all kinds of utopian visions. One of the most recent ones, which I show on the slide to the left side of the slide, is Innisfil, a rural town which was with a long history of progressive thinking. It was one of the first towns to accept cryptocurrency as a payment method for city services. And what we see is a kind of vision of how it might be developed into a kind of utopian garden city that represents a sustainable response, if you like, to the challenges of actual city development. And there's no question that these are useful exercises of the imagination, but the more immediate challenge we are going to be facing is the kind of challenge that a city like Jakarta is facing today, as it tries to move a population of 10 million people out of an area that is immediately challenged by the rise in global sea levels and climate change. And these kinds of challenges are being faced everywhere, from Houston to the cities of Northern Europe to even New York City, according to most projections. So whatever we may think about technological fixes to the reality of the future of cities, we face tremendous challenges. A second trend, which I've already alluded to before with respect to the smart city movement, is the way in which cities have become datapolises, which is to say cities of information. The availability of sensing networks, the availability of telematics, the availability of all kinds of data streams has created the possibility of thinking about cities as not just spatial and architectural and analog assemblages, but also as complex data systems. And some of the most exciting and interesting and promising work with regard to the future of cities and mobility systems in particular has to do with transforming these seas of data into governance structures that allow for the integration of all kinds of forms of behavior. We see some really beautiful examples of this, like the open transport platform, the open mobility platform that is being implemented in a number of cities, that allows for urban data to be integrated into transportation data through an open transport API for different transportation vectors, from mass transit to vehicle sharing systems, from bicycling to cars to trains to trams and other kinds of inputs, all to be organized into a unified system. And the implementation of these systems promises to address many of the kinds of pathologies that we inherited from the 20th century, particularly involving traffic and impeded movement. But however powerful these elements are, there is another reality, which is a reality that the pandemic has accelerated, and that is the reconversion of much of that transit structure of streets and so forth into new purposes, whether it's walking, cycling, or other forms of micromobility that are now being substituted for, as in the case of this plan for Hollywood Boulevard, the sort of iconic automobile street almost par excellence. A third trend that's crucial to bring to the table, I'm going to give two examples in a sense of this, which is the notion of the Superblock, the Superilles instituted in a city like Barcelona. This is very much a work in progress, but what is a Superblock? It's a territorial unit that is smaller than a neighborhood, but bigger than a residential block, that essentially takes the automobile-centered grids that we inherited from the 20th century and transforms them into larger units that are instead feature an increasing sense of connection between residents and the superblocks, these neighborhood-sized building blocks that they belong to. And that, of course, involves not only a refunctioning of those mobility corridors that are streets, their transformation for other uses, pedestrian, cycling, mass transit, and so forth. But it also involves an overall reconception, a kind of reclamation process that we'll see in trend number 5. But before getting to that trend, I want to just look at the transformation that the 20th century brought about. This is what Market Street in San Francisco looked like in 1906, right before the San Francisco earthquake. And you see the extraordinary kind of promiscuity of the mixing of different modes of mobility, from walking to riding in coaches to riding in trams, even to early automobiles, which will appear along this scene. And that was not the Market Street that I experienced when I lived in San Francisco for 25 years. This was the Market Street that I knew, and most San Franciscans have known for the past decades. It's a place where cars dominate and where people are in the way. They are obstacles. Obstacles to be avoided, perhaps even to be removed. Market Street has been transformed, maybe along the lines of the kind of transformations that superblocks also institute, with dedicated lanes. And what is most of all missing here is private automobiles. The car lane is dedicated to sharing vehicles. And this feeds into another facet of the emerging landscape of urban planning, which is the notion of the 15-minute city, la ville du quart d'heure, which was central to the mayoral campaign in Paris and involves a vision much like the Superblock vision, where yes, information systems are present, new technologies are present, but the dominant facet of urban design is the notion of proximity, of recentering, in a sense, rescaling the interaction between ordinary citizens and the places where they work, the places where they live, the places where they are engaged in social interaction and recreation. And it's that integration precisely that is central to the vision of the city that these various experiments put forward. And what are they based on? They're based on something that urban planners only 20 or 30 years ago were not thinking about as the driving force, the new protagonist after the automobile of the cities of today and tomorrow, which is micromobility, from walking to scootering to cycling. And it's this explosion of micromobility modes that has been the great surprise of the last decades, especially the past decade, where we've seen a vehicle type like the push scooter, the kick scooter, which was around for decades before, but now assuming a kind of potentially central role in the design of cities. And we're talking about an ecology here that runs from humans exercising that foundational form of autonomy that is walking all the way to e-bikes, which have speeds that begin to approach some of the two-wheeled motor vehicles, for example, that we've seen since the second half of the 20th century. But it's this explosion that I think is powerfully connected to information systems, and where AI enters the picture perhaps as a predictive element in the management of large-scale traffic systems, mobility systems, is probably more than anything going to be in the integration of these micro-mobility vectors with some of those other vectors, which will be part of the larger infrastructure, transportation infrastructure of cities today. So why this explosion of micro-mobility? First of all, the average trips that humans carry out are short. Micromobility is clean and efficient. It has much lower costs. It's fun. It's flexible. It's multimodal. In other words, it can engage with other vectors easily and be folded into them, and vice versa. And it has some real practical advantages for cities. Trips are short. It's shocking when you see how many of the trips that people today take in automobiles are on a kind of pedestrian or bicycle scale. So to switch those trips over from an automobile to a platform like a kick scooter, for example, is not only a way of eliminating some of the consequences of automobility, but it also has some cost benefits that are immediate. The 106 Segway 9-bot kick scooters equal the cost of a Tesla Model 3. The efficiency is self-evident when you just look at the environmental impact of a vector like an e-scooter, which is just one example of many, as I hinted at before. And I'm not going to go into this in any detail. That efficiency extends to space, to the use of space, which is one of the most precious commodities of cities today. One car equals any number of other lighter micro mobility vectors. The cost differential is dramatic. And it's even more dramatic when you introduce something like walking into the equation. If you ask people what is their most rewarding, gratifying mode of moving around the world, walking and bicycling almost always are the clear winners. Driving almost always comes in last place. And this multimodality, which I think is where technology becomes a key factor in the integration of this complex tapestry of different forms of mobility, is a crucial factor here. Because of course, there are distances, kinds of journeys that require different transportation vectors, different mobility vectors. For the 15-minute city, a scooter, a pedestrian, a bicycle are certainly more than sufficient for a great majority of trips. When we start to move to the scale of a full city, we start to need to introduce other kinds of vectors like mass transit vectors. And when we start to move between cities or between parts of the world, we add another layer. So the question is, how do we integrate this proliferation of vectors in a way that contributes to collective well-being, to the quality of life? That's where I think technology will play an absolutely decisive role. And from the standpoint of cities, micromobility really addresses a whole series of intertwined challenges that have faced cities really since the beginning of time, but now take on a new and distinctive coloration. We tend to underestimate, as a civilization, the costs of a commuting-based society, which was explicit in the vision of magic motorways that Norman Bell Geddes sketched out in that film with which I belong. Walking requires the least expensive infrastructure by comparison with any of the other infrastructures, but biking and mass transit also is very low in that pyramid. And so the real costs have to be quantified in order to persuade people to make the kinds of transitions that we're talking about. So I want to close with walking here. And of course, if you look at carbon emissions by transport mode, there's really no competition. Even bicycles and e-bikes lose out to that most fundamental expression of human autonomy, that is the choice of walking rather than driving. And certainly over the course of the past decades, we've seen the rise of different kinds of movements to promote pedestrianism as a mobility choice. Not to make pedestrianism the only mobility choice, but to intertwine pedestrians, to reestablish its foundational role with respect to visions of how cities should be designed today and tomorrow. And this redesign process has a financial component to it that should not be underestimated, which is the fact that walkability has emerged as one of the defining forces behind value in the real estate development world. People want walkability as a feature of their everyday life environment. And the more walkability there is, the greater value is assigned to a place and to an edifice. So this is where my own work and the work of Piaggio Fast Forward kicks in. I'm not going to linger over that in concluding, but I just wanted to mention the notion of innovating in the space of walking, this most fundamental, most primordial mode of expression, I think is maybe worth underscoring, because we think of walking perhaps as the least technological feature of our interaction with the world. And yet walking is a very complex process. The more you study it, the more you see its complexity. We make, as human beings, extraordinarily complex adjustments constantly as we move about the world. So to create a new world of smart vehicles, vehicles that can support not only pedestrianism as a mobility choice, but also interact with that world, use the capabilities of the very technologies that shape self-driving cars, but in the service of human autonomy, not to replace human mobility and thereby give rise to the many, many negative consequences that I alluded to at the beginning of this talk, I think is really crucial. So what are the takeaways here? The future is a future that's going to include not just cities as we think about them today, but megacities, largely megacities concentrated in the developing world. And those cities and megacities are going to come in all shapes and sizes. So instead of being uniform, services and solutions will have to be embedded in local realities, whether that's realities of history, of governance, of culture, of values, of landscapes. Population growth and the dislocations prompted by climate change will push traditional infrastructure challenges again to the fore. Water, sewage, power, mobility. And they're going to require a selective and a strategic approach to digital transformation. So, smart IoT and AI-powered cities, by all means, of course, to a certain degree, but in the service of people's sustainability, culture, and the quality of planetary life. And that's because cities are complex civic, spatial assemblages where the old and the new are undergoing constant realignment. And a city is simply not a computer. A lot of these sort of technocentric visions just underestimate the complexity of what we call a city or a town or a built environment. Whoops. So solutions will remain local. They're going to be rooted in local practices, local traditions. Smart cities will not exist in isolation. Rural areas are being ever increasingly brought into the fold of information and network systems, and they will undergo transformations at least as big as cities as well. Micromobility is going to be just as much a protagonist of the future of cities as macromobility. But the question is how micro and macro work together. Private automobiles will not be the protagonists of those present and future cities. And we're already seeing a decrease in their roles, which isn't to say that they will not be present. It's simply that they'll be present under different conditions. And I would argue that hyperlocalism is the new globalism, connected hyperlocalism. And last but not least, all of these choices have to be made in the service of an understanding of autonomy, not for machines, not a world where self-driving cars take the place of the cars that devastated urban areas over the course of the past half century, but in the service of autonomy for humans. And I'm going to stop there.
Jeffrey, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your very interesting lecture. And I have one question. Now we start with the question time. Please, I think maybe Lorenza, she's here with us. Because
Hello.
no, they are very, hi Lorenza.
Hello.
Many people ask, I have one question for you. What would you think about the digital mobility? There is a digital mobility. What is the impact of the digital mobility in this our environment and in the future for you?
What do you mean precisely, Maria Grazia, by digital mobility? What do you have in mind? I want to make sure I answer correctly.
I have in mind that in this moment you are human stopped mobility, and we are much more mobility through the digital connection, etc. So what's happening in your vision?
So that what you just described, which the pandemic has, of course, powerfully reinforced, that has been a trend since the 1980s, really, because if you look at the average speeds that people move around the world, those speeds have been paralyzed, basically, whether it's air travel, whether it's land travel, because of traffic in cities. Since the 1980s, we've been moving at the same physical, analog, somatic speed that we were going back into the 20th century. What has constantly accelerated is the speed of networks, the amount of connectivity that we share. And so I think what we're seeing in the pandemic is an acceleration of a trend, which is a long-term trend. And it's going to continue, in my view, and it will reshape the landscape because smart working, telecommuting, those were emerging features already a decade ago, and the pandemic has surely exponentially multiplied their presence, but it's going to leave traces. We are not going to go back to the prior mode of working. The world of business, the world of enterprise has understood some of the positives, not just the negatives, of a kind of distributed work model that uses the digital networks as a way of expanding and extending and reimagining certain kinds of aspects of everyday life. So that's going to have an impact on much of what I said before about the design of cities. And one of the things that I see that actually interests me a lot is the way the rural world and the suburban world is going to be transformed by connectivity. Because the parts of the rural world that have good bandwidth connections to the internet are already seeing migration of skilled workers to those places. And that is going to accelerate. So the big digital divide, I believe, is going to be between places that are well served by digital infrastructure and places that are not, irrespective of whether they're urban or rural. And that's a change, but it's a long-term change.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Thank you, Jeffrey. Lorenza, have you?
Well, I would say that it has a lot to do with governance too, in the sense of Italian situation, for example. We have very different range of positions and connectivity here. Talking about connectivity and connections and networks, we have lots of people answering our polls. Well, we will start from the very traditional one, that is, what city are you following us from? Apparently Milan is at the very top, but we have very different situation here, from Gubbio to Ancona and Switzerland. And then we have a very formal question too. Would you go back, please? Thank you. Well, a very big cloud of words that people use to define the relation between artificial intelligence and mobility. And I will share with you, Jeffrey, that you see there's the safety that is very, very big. So I would ask you a question about safety, because, we had an email dropping in today, and was, well, you're talking about mobility. Why are you talking about a driverless car and the situation about ethics and the possible consequences of having these cars running wild into our cities? So I would like to, get some insights from you about that.
Well, so my view is that any vehicle that defines the true protagonist of an urban landscape, who are the citizens, as an obstacle, immediately raises a concern. Because if cities have to be redesigned in order to make mobility safe for self-driving vehicles, then we've made a value decision which seems to me profoundly at odds with at least my vision of what cities are for, which is not to be perfect laboratories for self-driving vehicles. Because self-driving vehicle technology works great in the laboratory, but the minute you introduce it into highly complex, unstable, lively environments, like the environments that humans like to inhabit, they have difficulties. So what's the solution to that? Well, I would agree with the ethical concerns that the question implies, but what I would point to, it takes me back to the beginning of my talk, which is if we have collaborative relations between humans and machines, where smart machines interact with much smarter humans when it comes to navigating and inhabiting a human-centered world, like the environments that characterize cities and workplaces and so forth, we have a better world. It's a world that works better from the standpoint of those smart devices and machines, and it works for humans, and it works for the kinds of values that our society is built upon. So for me, I'm not against self-driving vehicles. I think self-driving trucks, for example, we will see them way before we ever see a self-driving car in a center city. My concern is that a world where self-driving cars can safely move humans around like passengers is a world where human pedestrians have been sacrificed, because they are a problem. And I feel similarly about robotic vehicles that want to operate with level 5 autonomy in high-density urban areas. They run the risk, and we see this in their how they have been deployed, of disrupting the very thing that makes cities such a vital and rewarding place for people to congregate. So again, autonomy for humans, not autonomy for machines, as I see it.
Thank you. And we have another question that I think is super interesting. So we started saying that you are the co-founder and co-director of the metaLAB at Harvard. And I would, kick on this question: where does art come in the sense of, would you mention some maybe case studies you think are very interesting of the connection of the AI as, a tool, a creative tool in designing a new approach to city and mobility?
Well, I'm not sure if, in terms of uses of AI for expressive or artistic or cultural kinds of experiments, I'm not sure I would necessarily associate them with mobility per se. But AI has been an area where I think some really exciting work is happening using AI, just like any tool that comes along, as a potential area that allows us to engage in creative practices that use some of the specific capabilities of AI to go beyond human-centric traditional models of artistic creation. The example that I showed you at the beginning of this talk, I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the background. I'm not sure what's going on. at the beginning of the talk was an example of taking an entire museum collection and having an AI analyze the way in which a human gaze is directed in paintings, photographs, coins, sculptures, and to take those collections and see if we can learn something about the artistic conventions that are medium specific to each of those media. That's just one example, but I've seen all kinds of examples of people taking, for example, corpora of photographs and augmenting and extending them, three-dimensionalizing them. There's just so many really magical things you can do with the kind of toolkit that an AI brings to the table. So I think we're just at the beginning of this kind of creative AI revolution, and I do believe it's going to revolutionize many aspects of artistic practice over coming decades. We're just at the beginning of that. Deep fakes are only a very banal expression of what AI can do in the realm of creativity.
Well, talking about that, you know that European Commission would be ready to sign and deliver an act against the high risk AI uses, such as, for example, I would say AI system of control on people or bias prevention, for example. So I would say that this is part of what we are going to, and this is part of what the AI Future Project is about. And because, you know, we are trying to promoting an idea of using mobility as a tool for community and for creativity. So going on with another question, I would pick one that is personal, but I think it's interesting too. Professor Schnapp, would you recall your very first memory of mobility in your life?
That's a hard one.
Yes, it is.
I think it was on two wheels. It was a bicycle trip, but
so micromobility.
I think the one I remember perhaps the most was when my family moved to Mexico City when I was 4 years old, and I remember getting on an airplane for the first time. It seemed like an extraordinarily exotic, almost magical, like, you know, carpet trip at the time.
Yeah. And again, well, how to encourage people to increase their walking and movement activities in the era where delivery distances are boosting. That's, well, for Italy, it's kind of new. Well, in the US, it's not. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a challenge where the design of our cities, the creation of infrastructure that supports pedestrianism, the creation of new categories of vehicles that support pedestrianism and more extended forms of movement like scooters and bicycle sharing systems and so forth. They're all part of a larger puzzle, I think. But the costs of not walking, we know what those costs are, and they're extraordinary if you really calculate them. I've run some calculations on this. If you could get humans worldwide to give up 1% of automobile trips, we would come very close to addressing most of the Paris climate goals right away. 1%. And in that 1%, there are many, almost all of those trips are trips that are literally less than in the range of 1 kilometer. I mean, really trivial distances. So why is it that those trips are taken in automobiles? Well, it's largely because of the design of our cities. It's largely because of incentive systems that are perverse. And they're part of a culture that has internalized these mechanisms and lost the sense of possibility of making alternative choices. The delivery-based economy is not necessarily opposed to models of pedestrian-centric behavior. I think I think that there are ways in which we could reimagine the delivery economy, aligned with the 15-minute city or forms of hyperlocalism. I think the future that we're trying to shape is a future where the regulatory frameworks that you alluded to are part of a larger puzzle where we really deploy technologies, but we deploy them in line with the values that are central to our vision of what a life worth living is, what a qualitative mode of engagement with the cities we live in might be.
Definitely. I would, if I can, share some new clouds. We have another cloud that we can share. Yes, the next one. Again. Okay. And so I would say that we have another part of question that maybe we can get to. Can we scroll, please?
The first, Roberto Pacidalò is
Oh,
my
yeah.
friend.
He's an artist too. So
He's
walking means slow down as well and see things differently. So we have a walking movement here. Shall we study better the past in order to develop strategies for the present? So what do you think?
Well, there's no question that our mobility choices are also cognitive choices. They're choices that shape the way we think, the way that we interact with the world, the way we don't interact with the world. And so one of the implications of the 15-minute city and the Superblock and all of these developments is to reconnect to the places that we inhabit, that we work in, that we play in. But I don't think it's about turning the clock back. I think it's about actually looking forward, because our relationship to those places, that hyperlocalism that I brought up in my final slide, is a connected hyperlocalism. And I think that's what the pandemic has brought out, that's very rich as a kind of prompt, which is, what does a new model of connection to place look like under hyper-connected, globally connected, networked modes of experience like the ones that have become integral to our everyday life thanks to the ubiquity of networks and the ubiquity of connected smart devices. That's the equation, the hybridity that I think is going to define the future of mobility.
And we also think that mobility has a large spread of meanings in the sense of, as Maria Grazia mentioned, digital space. And then we have also, as our partners from all over Europe are going to face, for example, inequality and sustainability and gender issues, all related to mobility. And so, the mobility theme is here. Flavio asked how AI in mobility could make mobility more sustainable. I think that Professor Schnapp answers this question all around this talk. So, that's a good one. How smart cities could be also inclusive cities. Well, that's tough.
Well, we could start by I think a strong step in the direction of inclusiveness is to begin to rethink the way cities over the course of the last half century have sacrificed working class and lower economic value districts in the service of the construction of highways, in the service of automobility, and in the process of reimagining city spaces, undo some of that damage that was done by re-equilibrating. So no, that's an important feature, I think, of what a truly smart city would be. But again, I think the notion of the smart city is a mystification. I think we need to be selective, we need to be local, and we need to be strategic in the way that we deploy technology platforms in ways that are rooted in local realities.
Thank you. Maria Grazia, would you share some thoughts about that? I cannot hear you. Well, I think you're muted, maybe.
Okay.
Okay.
We have many questions. Are you ready to answer all of these questions, please? Not now, maybe after, maybe the next Media Guru steps. Okay. Thank you so much for your amazing, extraordinary lecture, your cooperation with the Meet, and thank you really, Jeffrey. I would like to thank you also my team, Lorenzo, etc. I would like to thank to all of you, the public, for this participation. Very good participation, very interesting, amazing lecture. Thank you really, Jeffrey. And I would like just to remember before closing, I want to leave. I want to ricordare, così remember the next meeting of AI4Future, in cooperation with the V2 Lab for Unstable Media, to present the next AI4Future event. Please, if you are, there is the slide. Okay, what's next? 25 next month. With the other partner, we organize this they organize the second connection with Europe for this project. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Thank you so much. I hope to see you physically.
Yeah,
Virtual stage. I would like to invite you to visit Meet when you'll be in Milano. So we work together. Thank you so much.
Right. Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Ciao, Lorenzo.
Ciao.